Well, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're calling from. It's an honor to welcome you into the space and to open a conversation that sits at the heart of our movement. The role of research is strengthening, protecting, and advancing. Community violence intervention, as many of you know, the Black and Brown Research Collective has been pushing the field to rethink not just what we study, but how we study it. And who gets to define what counts as knowledge. Their work reminds us that research is not just an academic exercise. It's a tool for accountability, for truth-telling, and for ensuring that the lived experiences of our communities are not erased, misinterpreted, or overshadowed by institutions that have historically spoken about us rather than with us. Over the last few years, our country witnessed one of the largest reductions of gun violence in recent history. And while headlines may credit policing strategies, political leadership, or national trends, those of us in the CVI community know the truth. Our outreach workers, our credible messengers, our case managers, our healers, and our community partners played a profound role in that progress. We saw it block by block, relationship by relationship, and life by life. But here's the challenge. How do we prove that what we know in our bones is actually working? How do we ensure that our contributions are visible, measurable, and undeniable, especially when other institutions are quick to take credit? That's where research becomes essential, not as a stamp of legitimacy from the outside, but as a way to document the impact we see every day. When I was at Ready Chicago, research wasn't an add-on. It was the lifeline. It helped us understand what was working, what wasn't, and what we needed to change. It helped us refine our model, strengthening our support, and ultimately save more lives. And just as important, it gave our participants, men who have been written off by so many systems, the evidence that their progress made a difference in public safety, in healing, and in transformation as well. Research gave us language, it gave us credibility, it gave us power. And today, as the CVI field continues to grow, research is shaping the policies that govern our work, the funding that sustains it, and the public narrative that defines it. Without rigorous community-grounded evidence, we risk having others to tell our story for us. With it, we ensure that our story is told accurately, with dignity, and with the depth it deserves. That's why today's panel is so important for many reasons, and I would be honest, this is perhaps one of my favorite. We are joined by four extraordinary researchers, leaders who have been dedicating their careers, their lives to building the evidence base for CVI, to elevating community, engaging science, to asking the hard questions about what works, what doesn't, and why. Their work is not just academic, it's deeply personal, deeply political, and deeply connected to the communities we serve. These are some of the best minds in the field, people who I love, admire, respect, just simply because of the way they show up and the way they connect the dots for us. So without any further delays, I want to introduce an amazing colleague, friend, Dr. Jocelyn Fontaine, who I admire and who I continue to be behind cheering her on as she continues to lead one of the best institutions in our country around research. Jocelyn?
Thank you so much, Eddie, for a wonderful welcome and introduction to this conversation, and appreciate the kind words about me and the organization that I have the privilege to lead. Brings me a lot of joy. So it's nice to see you all virtually. Good afternoon. I'm Jocelyn Fontaine, the executive director of the Black and Brown Collective for Community Solutions to Gun Violence. And I very much appreciate the invitation from the CVI Action Plan Committee to speak on this webinar and having the opportunity to be connected with all of you, even though we're not together in the same space, but virtually this community of CVI practitioners, leaders, and stakeholders who are really committed to advancing the practice of CVI to save lives and to contribute to safer communities. It's really an honor. We're specifically talking today about the role of research, challenges and opportunities in building a stronger CVI field. You can go to the previous slide. I'm happy to share this conversation, the stage with my dear colleagues, Shawnee Buggs, Jordan Costa, and Talib Hudson, who you'll hear from in a little bit, who will each tackle one of the issue areas that is identified in the CVI Action Plan. So we're here this afternoon to offer our individual perspectives on some of the topics identified in the CVI Action Plan related to research and evaluation. We're drawing on our expertise and experiences as trained researchers using both quantitative and qualitative methods in various communities across the country where we have developed and led CVI research and evaluation projects and have learned a ton and continue to learn so much from the incredible work that's happening on the ground. In addition to our offering our individual experiences and perspectives, we were also drawn to this discussion since many of the issues that are highlighted in the action plan are very aligned with the very strategies we're trying to advance at the collective. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a bit. So specifically, as you can see on this slide, the action plan emphasizes that research, evaluation, quality improvement, and impact analysis, one of the plan's 6 core pillars, is really crucial to advancing and scaling CVI efforts across the country. The plan makes the argument that in order to secure long-term sustainable public sector funding, CVI strategies must be informed and backed by rigorous evaluation and research that demonstrates their effectiveness in keeping communities safe, and that high quality research can also be used to inform improvements in program design and delivery. Eddie was just talking about the role that research played in Ready Chicago work that he led there. So the action plan highlights the significant underfunding of gun violence research, especially compared to other leading causes of death, and the 4 key areas that we should be addressing as a field in the CVI research space. The importance of increasing the amount of research that's being conducted. We just simply need more research and evidence in this space. The second is the importance of building a pipeline of researchers that have lived experience, that come from communities, that are accountable to community. The third is diversifying the analytical methods that are used in the CVI field. And fourth is investing in deeper and more rigorous evaluations. And as I said, my colleagues, Jordan, Shawnee, and Talib will tackle each of these issue areas in the remarks later in this hour. So before I turn to them, next slide, please. As previewed, I just want to name that many of these key issue areas are very aligned with the collective priorities, which is why we were really honored to be invited to participate in this conversation. So I just wanted to give some context as to what we're doing as an organization to advance the gun violence prevention field, which of course includes CVI. We are very much intentionally here to partner with all of you to do more of this work to advance the practice of CVI. So for those of you who are a little less familiar with our organization, we are fairly new, but have been at this for decades previous to our launching a formal organization a couple of years ago. The Black and Brown Collective for Community Solutions to Gun Violence, or we call ourselves the B&B Collective or the Collective, is a nonprofit organization composed of about 36 professional staff and multidisciplinary scholar members from academic and research institutions from across the country. Our mission is to enhance community safety and wellness in communities throughout the United States, with a particular focus on the firearm-related violence that has plagued Black and Brown neighborhoods for decades. We intentionally foster collaboration across and within our various disciplines and collaborate closely with practitioners to improve the efficacy of research, policy, and practice on firearm-related violence and community violence. The resources we will draw on today, which I'll talk about in a little bit, really reflect the input and expertise of various collective scholar members and staff. You can see them here on the screen. Again, collaboration, collective work is core to what we do. We think we have better impact when we're drawing on our diverse training, experiences, and thinking to advance this work to have more impact. So really quickly, you can see the previous slide. You can see the collective members who are associated with the organization, the scholar members, as well as the professional staff. And then the next slide, you can see the geographic reach or where we all hail from across the country, really trying to advance this work in those specific places and nationally. Next slide, please. So the collective is really guided by 5 core strategies, which you can see here. We really strive to advance safer communities by engaging in and promoting rigorous, culturally responsive, and community engaged and collaborative research on community gun violence. We are deeply committed to engaging communities to inform our work and feel accountable to communities so that they are the beneficiaries of our research findings. We are committed to building and elevating the thought leadership and the bench of emerging scholars who are underrepresented in gun violence prevention research. And the fourth and our fifth strategies go hand to hand. We are trying to inform policy and practice responses, as well as the public and media narratives about the causes, consequences, and solutions to gun violence based on research. So as you can see here at a high level, 3 of our strategies are really aligned with the issues that are called out in the CVI Action Plan. So next slide, please. So to date, we have produced 2 research documents that we contend are really helpful in advancing gun violence prevention policy, research, and practice. I nod to them here as a bit of a shameful plug, and I'm happy to do that. I invite you to read more. But there's 2 reports that we have produced so far. One is the case for more equitable and community-engaged research that really talks about our why. So why more investments in building the bench, why more investments in scholars who are representative of community matters, that it's important for more impactful research, more impactful policy and practice. And the second report, which we call our research agenda, really outlines some research principles. So what we say is how you should do this work, as well as some research questions that we think are priorities for better understanding the causes and consequences of gun violence prevention and solutions, as well as better understanding how and why things are working. So the next slide is just a quick excerpt for one of the reports, the equity report, and says here, you can read it, and I'll also read it to you, is that limited funding, lack of representation, and narrowed scope of research really hinders innovation and solutions to gun violence, as well as other intractable problems. So that is our why. That's why we're here and why we're focusing on this work. And we can go to the next slide, an excerpt from our research agenda, as I mentioned, really focused on building more knowledge about gun violence, prioritizing research that centers the community's understanding, and really doing more research that explores and deepens our understanding of the consequences and responses and effective and promising solutions. I'm coming to the end here. I want to preview a report that we will be releasing very, very soon. So it's coming in the next couple of weeks here. A report that also benefited from the input of various collective scholars is it's a community engaged research framework document. And it's this practices guide that we developed based on work that we've done together and informed by conversations with community violence intervention practitioners to help the field really understand the practices that we think are more promising for engaging those who are at highest risk of violence, as well as the folks that serve them, like CVI practitioners, in order to produce more ethical, responsive, and impactful research. So a very quick plug for this. Again, this is the kind of work and the resources that we want to produce for the field that's informed by community and that we think can lead to more impactful research. The last one plug that I want to give 2 slides is about our mentorship and training program. So we are currently implementing a program that leverages the lessons learned from existing training and mentorship initiatives to create and sustain a robust scholar network that focuses on transformation and impact. So as I mentioned, one of our core strategies is building the bench. of emerging scholars who are from underrepresented backgrounds because we believe that that is limiting our understanding of gun violence and what works to prevent it. So we have a mentorship and training program that we are in the midst of implementing now. And then the next slide shows what is involved in this mentorship strategy or this program. We are doing research training for emerging scholars, really giving them tools about how to do equitable research that we think more meaningfully engages community and can lead to better research. We are providing them one-on-one mentorship. So to keep folks who are trying to do this work in this community, continuing to help them advance their scholarship and work and professional careers. And then we're also providing professional development opportunities for these scholars and competitive research awards, grant making to support their research and their scholarship. Again, because we know that we need more research, more evidence in this space in order to bring about reductions in gun violence. And so with that, I'll turn it to my colleague, Talib Hudson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn, for the introduction. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Dr. Talib Hudson, and I'm here to talk about the case for more research funding and more rigorous evaluations within the community violence intervention space. First, let's talk about what research tends to focus on in what's considered the existing evidence base. Right now, most research tends to focus on the effectiveness of programs and models and ask a question, for example, did violence go up or did violence go down? Most of the existing research tends to look at what happened. Did X cause Y? Did this action or interaction cause this kind of reaction? Some of the research also looks at implementation processes and barriers. So if we're looking at did X cause Y, we're looking at is this program helpful or effective at making violence go up or go down? And a study may also look at how well was a particular model or program implemented and what were barriers to success. And research also, not as much, but there is some research that also looks at perceptions and narratives. For example, looking at how people view safety in their community. What does it mean to feel safe? What are the implications of gun violence? Why might people carry guns or why might people use guns in various situations? This is what we call the existing academic literature, the existing research tends to focus on. However, what research tends to focus a little bit less on is on local strategies. What are people doing in very specific localities, whether that's New York, LA, Chicago, or even, say, Baton Rouge, or Omaha, or Nashville, Durham? What about in particular rural communities, not just some of the big cities? What is the indigenous knowledge that is already being developed by folks who are doing the violence prevention work in their communities? On top of that, not just looking at did violence go up or did violence go down, but looking at how did the violence go up? Why did the violence go down? What are the mechanisms by which violence and the issues and the context around violence is being affected? How do we define and describe and document what people themselves are doing or have been doing, whether that was part of an established program or model, or whether that was some kind of indigenous knowledge that people had before? And part of the reason why research focuses less on this is something that in academia we tend to call the hierarchy of evidence. Now, for any trained researcher, you are very familiar with what is called the hierarchy of evidence. And this image shows the extent to which certain kinds of data information gathering is considered reliable to say, hey, we think we know what happened or why something happened or what caused one other thing to happen. So when we're looking at this pyramid, we can see that expert opinion is at the bottom. Now, what unfortunately what that means is that for many of us who are practitioners in the field, who are experts, what we believe to be true, as Eddie mentioned, what we feel and know to be true in our bones. And when we look at formalized academic research, that's actually considered to be at the bottom of what's considered the most reliable for evidence. From there, we go to case studies, which is looking at documenting what has kind of happened, a bit of what I talked about before earlier. Quasi-experimental gets into saying, hey, we couldn't exactly have an experiment. We all go back to our elementary and middle school science classes. We couldn't develop an experiment to see if one action caused any reaction, but we're kind of using very fancy mathematical tools to figure that out. Then what is called the gold standard is the randomized controlled trial, or commonly known as the RCT. The reason why the RCT is known as the gold standard or the best is because what it attempts to do is allocate for and isolate all the different factors, otherwise known as variables, why some kind of phenomena might have happened. A very broad example that is often used is in medical science. For example, if there is a new pain medication that some scientists want to give to the public, they have to test it first and see, does it work? Well, if it's a pain medication, you want to know, does it reduce the pain? Well, if you just give this pain medication to any number of group of people, some people's pain may go down and some may not. But you're not going to know, was it that medication that caused the pain to go down? So what you do is you try to take a randomized group of people. So you're not looking at any particular demographic or other kind of reason for these folks. You're randomizing them. So you get a sample of the population. Some folks will get the pain medication. That's what we call the treatment group. Some folks will not. And that's what we call the control group. And then we want to see that the people in the control group and the treatment group, to what extent were their outcomes similar? And because it's randomized, then you can say, well, then we can account for any other factor, any other variable other than whether it was not the pain medication. Now, here's a little secret about research. Even when you do the gold standard of randomized control trial, you can never prove anything to 100%. Very rarely in research will scientists say, we know that a thing is absolutely proven to 100 exactly percent. So these are kind of the challenges that we're looking at. And then a systematic review is looking at the study of all the studies. But this leaves us with some big gaps to fill. What it means then is that we don't have consistent measures of looking at how CVI is done in one place or another, or even looking at what we're talking about when we're talking about CVI. Do we have consistent methods and strategies? So, for example, what one person may call street outreach in New York might look different in, say, Tuscaloosa. It's just a different context. Are they really the same thing? Are the practices the same? The way people are communicating? How do you isolate the variable? It's very difficult to do. And so then there are these what we call constraints of saying what is or is not rigorous, because in research, you want to say the research was rigorous, and which meant that it was done to a very high standard and a very high level of quality. I think one thing that we can do to get around this, instead of looking at just this model or this program, is to maybe look at the frameworks of how the work is done, frameworks for looking at models and practices. So instead of saying, hey, did this program versus that program work, it's what are the things that people are doing? The who, what, when, where, why, and how. Is it a social worker who was operating in an office in the middle of the day? Or is it someone who is formerly incarcerated who was out on the street at 2 a.m.? Two very different kinds of work. Both may be involved in CVI, but if we want to really start to understand the field, we need more research that does this. Which brings us to the question that so many people are asking of, is CVI effective? Well, based on the research hierarchy that I showed earlier in the hierarchy of evidence and what can or cannot be proven, it's very difficult to say. It's very difficult to have a definitive answer, because oftentimes we're looking at, did this model work in this city? And so we're looking for, Does that prove that this model will work in another city? It's hard to say that 100% of the time, if not impossible. And so what we have is we have some mixed results from different studies from a research perspective, which means we still have gaps and limitations. But guess what? That's actually part of science. That in and of itself is not a bad thing. That just means we have more things for us to look forward to. And so, in looking forward, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, meaning that just because we may not have a study that proves that one program or strategy worked doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It just means we need more research on it and we need to understand those practices. More research is coming out every day, every year, and we're excited about that, including the work that we're doing here and those partnerships that have been forming between practitioners and academics is really key to making sure that the research is done in the right way. And speaking of those partnerships between academics and practitioners, I can think of no better person to talk about the case for diversifying analytical approaches in the CVI space than one of my favorite scholars slash activists slash academics, my colleague, Dr. Jordan Costa.
Wow. Thanks, Talim. I knew you were going to intro me, but I didn't know it was going to be that. So thank you. And thanks everyone for joining. So analytical methods, like Talib said, when we talk about evaluating CVI, the conversation often starts in the same place with the focus on shootings and homicides. Did they go up? Did they go down? And by how much? And that's understandable because police data is often the most visible and accessible data set we have when it comes to violence. Alongside CDC data, which is also informative but often slow to become publicly available, it tends to be what gets reported out, what journalists cite, and what policymakers look to when they're trying to understand what's happening in a city. But as researchers, we also have to be honest about what those numbers actually represent. So you'll see here, police data tells us when violence has already occurred. It captures the end point of violence, but it tells us far less about the processes that interrupt it. And that distinction matters because most CVI strategies are designed to operate much earlier in the chain of events. Outreach workers mediate conflicts before they escalate. Hospital responders intervene during moments when retaliation is highly likely. Case managers spend months helping someone stabilize housing, employment, or mental health so that the next crisis doesn't spiral into violence. And so when those interventions work, the most common outcome is that nothing happens. The fight doesn't escalate. The retaliation doesn't occur. The person at the highest risk chooses a different path. But nothing happened is a very difficult thing to measure with traditional crime data. So if our research methods only measure violence once it has occurred, we're studying the aftermath of violence rather than the processes that prevent it. And this creates a disconnect between the way violence intervention actually works on the ground and the way we often try to evaluate it as researchers. And for me, that realization really came into focus when I was working on my dissertation, Pathways to Peace. I realized pretty quickly that the data that was publicly available at the time just wasn't going to answer the questions that I had. It couldn't tell me what the work actually looks like day to day, who the workers are, how they came to understand their roles and their impact, how they think about staying in the field or leaving it. And so I had to approach the research very differently. I worked directly with the CVI organization to develop the research questions and ultimately had to conduct a mixed methods case study that included 6 months of participant observation, interviews with staff, and document analysis. I had to see the work up close. I had to talk directly with the staff about their experiences, and I had to look at how they themselves were documenting and interpreting the work that they were doing. And so for me, between 6 months of formal research, but years of trust building beforehand and continued support since, I had to become embedded in the networks surrounding my study because that immersion was necessary to tell the story. And I don't want to make it sound like that process was easy and came without challenges, but they were really important challenges to navigate if we want to be able to produce good CVI research, because what became clear very quickly is that the work itself is far more complex than most evaluation frameworks can account for. And so that raises a broader question for researchers in this space, which is, what does it actually mean to measure success in violence intervention? If we only focus on shootings and homicides, we're essentially observing the very end of a much longer causal pathway. But CVI strategies are designed to influence the steps that come before that endpoint. Next slide. So I'm going to linger on this slide a little bit because there's a lot here and I want you to have time to listen and read. But one place research can expand is how we think about outcome variables. I know Talib touched on this already, but it's worth reiterating that there are a number of indicators that can help us understand whether interventions are working long before a citywide violence trend shifts. So, for example, we can look at reductions in retaliation after violent injury, successful conflict mediations, sustained engagement with services, or stabilization indicators like employment, housing access, or educational participation. These outcomes don't replace that violence reduction is the ultimate goal, but they help us understand whether the mechanisms of intervention are functioning the way programs intend them to. We can also pay attention to the relational environments people are embedded in. So individuals at the highest risk of violence often move within tightly connected social settings where conflicts and retaliatory pressures circulate quickly. And much of CVI work involves helping people expand those circles of support. So introducing mentors, connecting them to services, strengthening family ties, or building relationships that make different choices possible in moments of crisis. And studying how those supportive relationships develop over time can offer really important insight into how violence prevention happens in practice. There's also community level outcomes that matter but are rarely studied in the field. Things like trust in local intervention workers, willingness to seek help during escalating conflicts, or the strength of community-based support systems as a whole. So all of these measures help us understand whether intervention strategies are reshaping the conditions that allow violence to spread in the first place. And so to that end, another place where CVI research needs to broaden is methodologies. Like Talib mentioned, RCTs are not the right fit for this body of work and should not be considered our gold standard. As a community engaged researcher, I'm certainly not comfortable interacting with someone who's at the highest risk of being shot or shooting someone else and saying, you're in the control group, you're not getting access to the full extent of help that you could be provided for research. And I think many of us on this call would tend to agree. And that's just scratching the surface of ethics. There's also real practical issues. CVI programs are highly adaptive. They operate through relationships, local credibility, and rapid responses to changing conditions in community. And those dynamics are difficult to standardize in the way experimental designs often require. That doesn't mean that rigorous evaluation isn't possible. It just means rigor needs to take different forms. So quasi-experimental designs, longitudinal qualitative research, social network analysis grounded in community partnerships, participatory research with practitioners, ethnographic research, and mixed methods approaches that combine administrative data with community-based insight can all help us examine how interventions actually function within real contexts. And even within community-engaged research, there's a spectrum in how that work actually happens. In the framework our working group developed that Jocelyn mentioned earlier, we offer a map of that continuum for the field. And so on one end, you have research that's fairly extractive, where community partners may only be consulted. And then on the other hand, you have work that is truly community-led, where people most affected by the issue are shaping the actual research questions, the methods, and how the knowledge gets used. And so the important thing to understand is that engaging community in research is not a checkbox, it's a practice, and it requires researchers to share power in the process of building knowledge. But the reality is that many research institutions still reward speed and productivity more than they reward relationships and community partnership. And so researchers who want to do this work well often find themselves navigating that tension. And many of us are trying to push back on those structures and shift them, but institutional change, as we all know, moves quite slowly. So part of this work is also being transparent with community partners about where those systems are at right now while continuing to push towards something better. Because when this kind of work is done well, it's incredibly rigorous. And what kind of richer data can be generated than that which comes from co-producing knowledge with the people who are living and working within these conditions every day? So in other words, diversifying analytical methods isn't about lowering the bar for evidence. It's about using tools that are capable of capturing the complexity of CVI work. And if we're going to do research on this topic, we do have a responsibility to do it well. At the end of the day, CVI is still relatively a young field from a research perspective, and the way we study it right now will shape how it grows. And if our research frameworks are too narrow, we do risk overlooking much of what practitioners and communities are actually building. But if our methods evolve alongside the work itself, drawing on multiple forms of evidence, community knowledge, and interdisciplinary approaches, and practicing the innovation we ask practitioners, figuring out how to best serve their communities, then we have an opportunity to develop a far more complete understanding of how safety is created and sustained. As one small step in that direction, the Black and Brown Collective has been putting together a research library that gathers many of the key studies and resources in the field. I think I just saw it go in the chat, but it's not comprehensive. I don't want to set that standard, but it will keep growing. But if you're looking for a starting point to explore the evidence around CVI, it is a helpful place to begin. Because ultimately, the challenge for researchers isn't just to measure whether violence declined, It's to develop ways of learning from people who are already doing the work of intervention and prevention every day. And when our research can bring light to those practices rather than flatten them, it becomes far more useful, not just for scholarship, but it also allows us to really use research for the purpose of service and strengthens the strategies communities are using to keep each other safe. With that, I'll pause and turn things over to Dr. Shani Buggs, whose scholarship and thought leadership has been helping move this conversation forward by challenging the field not only to invest in stronger research, but cultivating the next generation of researchers doing this work. So over to you, Dr. Buggs.
Thank you, Dr. Costa, and thank you to my colleagues on the call, and also all of you in the audience today and who will be listening to the recording. So I am rounding out the team talking about the case for building pipelines for more researchers in the CVI space. And the need for culturally competent and responsive researchers in the CVI space for trauma-informed and collaborative learning and evaluation partners is more urgent than ever. As the action plan calls out, building the pipeline of researchers in the CVI space is critical to the field's growth and strengthening for numerous reasons. You've already heard some from the other speakers today. In order to secure long-term sufficient and sustainable funding for the public and private sector, we have to generate knowledge and scholarship that demonstrates not just whether CVI strategies are successful at creating safety in our communities, as Talib talked about, but also the essential details about how they are successful, why they are successful, for whom they are successful, and in which social and political, local, and state contexts they are most successful. And research has helped us do that through systematic data collection and analyses that ideally involve both the numbers and the narratives, the counts and the experiences that involve and impact CVI participants, the frontline workers, the organization leaders, and the communities they serve. High quality research can also give us insights on how CVI program designs and implementations can be refined and strengthened to make strategies work even better. It is impossible to develop effective policies without further understanding the nature of a problem, the causes of a problem, which specific approaches will be effective, and the methods to implement and scale those approaches. And we need different disciplines engaged in contributing, to this knowledge generation. Having multidisciplinary research teams and scholars tackling complex problems such as violence allows us to bring different perspectives and strengths, and our approaches are strongest when they work together. But we know that research has historically done a lot of harm in our communities. And even CVI-related research has sometimes contributed to harm by not centering those at greatest vulnerability or risk of violence. Who conducts the research in our communities absolutely matters. And much of the narrative about who was involved in gun violence research and who is capable of doing high quality and rigorous research in our communities with our communities has excluded Black and Brown researchers and scholars doing the work. And narratives about that matter because it helps to perpetuate the false idea that only certain researchers care or are skilled enough or are rigorous enough to use science to examine complex issues in our communities. Contrary to persistent narratives that there have only been a handful of researchers focused on gun violence up until about the mid-2010s, over the course of my own nearly 15-year study of gun violence prevention, I personally have met or read publications of dozens of Black and Brown researchers who have studied CVI strategies or the causes, impacts, and intersections of gun violence with other elements of community, such as housing or employment or education, for years before I entered the field. And not only had those scholars been studying gun violence for longer than I had, they also came from different disciplines, which meant that they brought meaningfully different expertise and perspectives from my own. The problem has not been that other Black and Brown gun violence scholars haven't existed. It's that we have consistently been overlooked and undervalued. And this narrative that up until this decade, there were only about a dozen or two virtually all white researchers studying this issue, a narrative that was perpetuated by this 2022 New York Times article on the screen and the 2023 US News and World Report's article is just not true. But it is true that far too much of the research to date, especially that which has guided violence intervention and prevention policy and practice, has excluded the priorities and perspectives and needs of those most proximal to and most harmed by the persistence of community violence and health inequity. And much of the research that has guided policy and practice on public safety and public health has not been carried out by scholars who represent and are accountable to the very communities that systematically bear the burden of structural and interpersonal violence in this country. The reasons for these disconnects largely tied to various dimensions of structural racism. Well before the current gutting of funding for research at federal agencies like the National Institutes of Health and the CDC, there were huge disparities in research funding available for Black and Brown scientists. One study found that, again, prior to this current administration's attack on scientific research, the National Institutes of Health annually awarded more than $40 billion for research. Yet among the NIH R01 grants, which are the top research grants awarded in 2018, only approximately 1% were awarded to Black scientists. Research has also found that Black and Brown scholars are systematically less likely than their white counterparts to receive R01 grant awards, even after controlling for measures like academic achievement, educational background, training, and previous research awards. And a subsequent examination of this inequity in NIH-funded research awards found that the topic choice accounted for about 20% of the overall funding disparity. Black applicants tend to propose research on inequities and topics that disproportionately impact Black and Brown communities, as well as topics that involve human subjects and examine community-led interventions. And even though we know that violent victimization increases risk of violent injury and has far-reaching impacts on homicide survivors, on loved ones, and on community members, 0% of NIH-funded research on violent fatal injuries between the years 2009 and 2019 focused on individuals victimized by violent crime. And a 2022 study found that only about 1% of all peer-reviewed articles on gun violence published in 2021 involve participation from those communities most affected. Furthermore, in the academic world, research grants and the ability to obtain research funding and to publish in academic journals are critical criteria for promotion and tenure. But research disparities in research funding, along with reported experiences with various forms of racism in the academy, have led to failed tenure cases for Black and Brown faculty and to burnout and the subsequent exiting of the academy before reaching tenure. But the Black faculty who stay in academia are half as likely to receive research awards as principal investigators than are white principal investigators, and they are burdened with spending twice the amount of time grant writing to achieve the same funding levels as white PIs, while also performing substantially more service to support students and mentees, particularly those of color. And these multiple burdens leave Black and Brown researchers with less time to do research, particularly community-engaged research, particularly the type of research needed for the CVI field, less time to publish papers, less time to gain exposure, to develop the relationships and community needed, to less time to train and inspire diverse students, and to attain the promotion and positions needed to achieve levels of academic power. And all of these gaps in research funding and in the support for Black and Brown faculty are themselves forms of structural racism. So, in other words, researchers who are more likely to execute community-engaged research and investigate health inequities are less likely to secure funding, to have the time and capacity to conduct thoughtful community-engaged research, and to successfully conduct the very research needed to center community interests and expertise to address health equity. And for the field of CVI, the centering of community interests is critical. Proximity matters. Accountability to and engagement with the communities most impacted matters. We know that research with a racial and health equity focus is necessary to grow the body of scholarship on community violence prevention that actually leads to sustainable change to the health and safety of our communities. We know that Black and Brown researchers have a unique and necessary perspective that they bring to their research due to their positionality. That intersection of lived experience and racial and ethnic identity, combined with our motivation to urgently see radical change that brings peace and liberation to the lives of families that are or that resemble our own, and that proximity, that consideration of the structural and environmental and historical and community contexts, and that accountability of conducting research that reflects the humanity and the complexity and the harms inflicted within communities most impacted by gun violence absolutely matters when it comes to thinking about everything from research questions to ask and study designs to use, to ownership of the data, to interpretation, implications, and dissemination of the research findings. It is false to think that every scholar does not bring their own perspectives and identities into their research. And rather than viewing that as a research flaw, We can strengthen and help build the CVI field through our positionality by recognizing and embracing how intimate understanding of these contexts surrounding an issue may affect the causes and consequences and responses. All of us as CVI researchers recognize the real and potentially even stronger impact that the field can make, and we need to be able to do more. We need to be able to collaborate with CVI organizations around the country, and we need more scholars to do that work. We need more partnerships, and we need the time, the opportunity, and the capacity to build the relationships with CVI organizations, to earn your trust, to work closely with you as leaders, as practitioners, as frontline experts, so that we can co-design and co-produce the knowledge and scholarship needed to strengthen our field, impact policy and practice, and shift narratives and actions that ultimately result in transformational change and sustained peace for all of our communities. And with that, I will turn it back to Jocelyn.
Thank you, Shawnee. And I think we landed this right on time. So folks, there's a couple of questions already that are in the Q&A box, and so I'll start there. But if you have other things on your mind that we can try to get the time to get to, we welcome questions in the chat and would love to answer them. So the first question, or one of the questions, I'm going to send this to Jordan, is an individual is interested how CVI organizations, so folks who are working in community or doing CVI work, how they can build a relationship with community engaged researchers like you or others in the collective or others to realistically do the kind of work that you were describing as part of your dissertation work.
That's interesting because I thought you were going to take a different approach from like how can we as researchers build relationships with community? And I don't mean to flip it, but I think that's actually where the important part is. Like we should be embedded in the communities that are looking for research to be done so we can be accessible and people know about us. And I think obviously the collective is a collection of people that people have access to, but we should be accessible within our own communities. So that people know that we're there as a resource. Obviously, I was uniquely positioned as someone who was doing their PhD in Newark and has been involved in coalition work and is from New Jersey. So I had access in different ways, and other people were invested in like my research journey in a unique way. But I think it goes both ways, right? Like institutions and individuals should be making themselves available to communities that have programming or are highly impacted. And then also, folks should be looking for us and resources like the collective and reaching out without any judgment. Like we're here to help.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat that's about how are we defining the term CVI? So I think I will direct that to you, Dr. Bugs. I'll be equal opportunity.
Thanks. I appreciate the question. And I appreciate the fact that the words community violence intervention mean something to the field, and yet the different ways that it is actually operationalized on the ground illuminates, I think, an opportunity for research to help bridge gaps and really pull out the different ways that people interpret what CVI means. I believe that all of us here on this call would say that CVI approaches are non-punitive and person-centered strategies that work with individuals at the highest risk of violence involvement and help engage them in authentic relationship and connect them to supportive services while being role models, peer mentors, coaches. I know that some CVI specialists are uniquely trained in conflict mediation and violence interruption. And I know that that is not a universal way of that organizations think about CVI. The engagement around individuals at highest risk, I think, is a commonality. But I think the question illuminates an opportunity for the field as a whole to really identify where there are differences in interpretation and contend with how those differences play out in the ways that we think about what's successful, how is it successful, why is it successful. So Yeah, a plug for research to help answer that question. Because I know Dr. Costa was involved in a publication that really sort of illuminated the fact that there are currently exist different definitions for what CVI actually means. And that's a testament to, I think, the growing nature of the field. And it represents an opportunity for us to really further illuminate that and understand how these different definitions work on the ground and how they work.
Just because Shawnee lifted up a publication that you are part of, Jordan, is there anything you wanted to add to that comment?
No, I think Shawnee covered it, but I think it's just to double down on the importance. Like, if we keep operating in a field that carries multiple definitions, we will never get to a place where we understand what we're doing fully. And so, it is the work of all of us to get to that place where we're speaking with a unified voice and like understanding as a collective what we're working to accomplish.
Thank you. Someone asked the question about the relationship between um, CBI, so cognitive behavioral interventions, and reductions in violence. And because you haven't yet spoken, Dr. Hudson, I will turn it to you, but welcome other folks' thoughts on this.
Sure. And what I would say is that there are certain folks who are using cognitive behavioral interventions and they're doing a wonderful job at it. One of the people who, of course, comes to mind is my brother JT, out of Baltimore, who has been doing cognitive behavioral interventions work. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, and JT's kind of hit me up, I think he even has their own spin on the terminology. But that doesn't mean, again, going back to what I said earlier, that somebody else in some other random place can say, "Oh, I'm gonna just do CBI too, and it's gonna work exactly the way it worked for Roca in Baltimore or some or the different places that Roca has done it." That's not how the work works, right? I mean, I love chocolate chip cookies. I'm a huge fan of chocolate chip cookies. We might all agree on what we consider to be a chocolate chip cookie to be, but I promise you, not every chocolate chip cookie is the same, right? So, and I don't even got to go into why. Some got salt, some not. Some are like in a store bought. Some are. Did you bake the chocolate chip cookies, right? So just because you have a particular program or a particular model or a particular intervention doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work the same way in every circumstance, regardless of who's doing it, where it's being done, how it's being done. And that goes back to the frameworks for understanding models versus practices, and going back to what Jordan was talking about in diversifying our analytic method. So yes, CBI has been very effective for some people in some locations and in some circumstances.
Thank you. There's a question here about how the collective, we as an organization, is supporting skill development in quantitative methods. So, PhD programs like economics and others, public policy, that are most likely to teach quantitative methods are well known to lack representation from communities with lived experience. So, can you speak a little bit more, Shawnee, about how our program is? The training and mentorship program is trying to address this issue.
Yes, and I also welcome you to weigh in on this, as given your position
Yeah.
in thinking about this very question. I think, what we, as I mentioned in my remarks, the power of numbers and narratives, the power of mixed methods and multi-method research is really, I think, critical to furthering our understanding within the CVI field and strengthening the field. And we have within the collective, we're developing training specifically around strengthening quantitative community engaged research, so that we are still, considering how the research is culturally responsive and engaged with community, but recognizing that the numbers matter, and there is a need to bring sophisticated and highly analytical quantitative approaches to CVI research and to gun violence research as a whole. but holding together with the importance, the critical nature of it being community engaged and culturally responsive. And so the mentorship and training program is including that training. And yeah, Jocelyn, I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to.
The last thing I will say, and I know that we're at time, I see Eddie has come back on the screen, is to say that our program is open to people who are trained in economics, right? So we don't see it as what we're trying to do with this program and uh, community engagement as only being in the domain of certain disciplines or folks with specific training. We think it's applicable to the broad field of folks who are doing this work. So we welcome those perspectives. We welcome the opportunity to partner with and work with folks who are coming from that training. So shout out if there's folks on this screen here to be in touch about how they can be involved in the program. And I'm supposed to also say that we weren't able to get to all of the questions that were in the Q&A, and they're really great. And I want to make sure that I'm saying this in the way that I'm supposed to, is that you can email unanswered questions to cviconvening at gmail.com, and we'll do our best to follow up. And we are very easy to get in touch with. You can check out our website, which has our general email address there, but we welcome continued conversation from folks to answer questions and potentially to partner. Thank you all so much. Over to you, Eddie.
Thank you, Dr. Fontaine. Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. And a special thank you, both our panelists, the people behind the scenes, to really make this happen. I want to just kind of summarize a few things that I heard today. And I really honestly, I wish we had more time to discuss this even further. You're just scratching the surface in terms of the conversation, whether if I'm hearing from Dr. Bugs around how race plays into this work, or the lack of support from federal government. She mentioned um, the NIH, for example, right? And the article there. There was comments that were made about economists, for example, right? But I would also argue that for so long, folks with um, other disciplines, as in criminology, have been funded, to do this work. And I'm just thinking about, like, what's the diversity from people in public health or people with social work backgrounds, right, to also help inform this work. People who actually I heard from you all are really have drawn proximity. That's another big thing that I heard from our panelists today. This idea of proximity, from Dr. Hudson. What is the right study approach? And from Dr. Costa, the importance of research and community, like being able to build those relationships so it doesn't feel like you're just parachuting. I have so many examples of institutions that approached me back when I was at the YMCA about, researching our programs. And at the end of the day, just it wasn't, never felt like it was inclusive or that the community would actually benefit besides the researcher. And so I'll end by just simply pointing out that as the CVI field continues to grow, the evidence is what ensures what we're not just responding to violence, but transforming the conditions that create it. It's what helps us refine our models, strengthen our programs, and advocate for policies and funding that match the scale of the need. And a big thing that we did not talk about enough, but I heard you, Dr. Hudson, about this question around implementation, right? The cookie example you gave, right? The metaphor. Implementation, like how often do we study that? How often do we really think about what it takes to really move things from one city, one model, whether it's CBT or CBI or whatever it is, right? I could tell you that there's a lot that goes with implementation and often not enough resources support that. So I want to just thank you all for your time, for bringing a level of expertise into this conversation. I'm looking forward to our next webinar where we're going to talk about narrative. The Javi have been entrusted to kind of bring the CVI Action Plan together to think about across the country the voices of others. Of how do we talk about this? How do we use science and data to really elevate the narrative and vice versa? And so excited for what's to come. But one of the things that I saw, Dr. Fontaine, in the map that you pointed out, which is very evident even with the people that are joining this conversation, is that we, overall, all of us, right, have to find ways to engage communities that are not in these conversations. And so I look forward for us to continue to work together. I look forward to the folks that are joining on this call to work together in that space. And with that being said, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for those who were able to join us, and look forward to our next webinar, which is March 26th. Have a good rest of your day.